Is the future a cruel place? Will humanity fail because of its own arrogance and destroy itself? Time and again, people claim to have visited distant centuries. However, what they claim to have seen on their time travels could also be straight out of a horror science fiction movie. In one of these cases, a person claimed to have been capitulated to the year 2137 during a military experiment. But who was this mysterious man who blew up the fabric of space and time? How credible does his story seem? And what incredible things does he claim to have experienced? The U.S.-American Al Bielek, who by his own account was a strange child, was born into an otherwise intact family in 1927. He claimed that his first memory goes back to a Christmas party he attended at a tender age of 9 months. But that's not all. While most toddlers haven't even spoken their first word at that time, Al could follow adult conversations effortlessly, an extraordinary gift that would accompany Al for the rest of his life. Blessed with an unparalleled intelligence, he was known to those around him as a walking encyclopedia, outperforming his classmates in every aspect. But when Al was a young man, duty called, and he eventually found himself aboard the USS Aldridge to help fight the Nazis. From then on, however, fate had a series of incredible twists in store. Al is said to have actually taken part in the infamous Philadelphia experiment and had been capitulated into another timeline in the process. Whether and in what form the Philadelphia experiment took place is still highly controversial today. According to legend, the Americans tested an unprecedented stealth technology in 1943. As part of this, the USS Aldridge became completely invisible and even briefly appeared in the port of Norfolk, Virginia, 500 kilometers away, before rematerializing at its starting point in Philadelphia. But while the testing of the cloaking mechanism had the desired effect, the consequences for the men on board are said to have been devastating. Some crew members later claimed that some of their comrades melted into the ship. Others reportedly went up in flames while still alive, and still others disappeared without a trace and were never seen again. In fact, some crew members are said to have vanished into thin air years after the experiment or died of mysterious illnesses. And suddenly, I landed in the year 2137. The U.S. Navy vehemently denies that such an experiment ever took place. All alleged facts and evidence are fictitious. The self-proclaimed eyewitnesses were nothing but frauds who wanted to profit from the tall tale. Well, Al Bielek's report naturally sounds somewhat different. Together with his brother, he managed to jump off the ship in the panic and confusion on board. But instead of finding themselves in the ocean afterwards, the brothers ended up in the year 2137. There, Al was first given insight into the hospital world of the future. As he had suffered severe radiation injuries, he was treated using futuristic methods based on vibrations and light. Furthermore, hospital entertainment consisted exclusively of educational and news programs. Other channels simply no longer existed. However, Al quickly realized that the face of the Earth had changed dramatically in 2137. The coastlines of all the continents had shifted drastically. The state of Florida had completely disappeared except for the northwestern tip. Atlanta was now only 5 kilometers from the Atlantic, and the individual Great Lakes were now just one gigantic body of water. And people's everyday lives had nothing to do with what Al knew from his time. The infrastructure of the United States had completely collapsed, and the government was also a thing of the past. Where once the United States and Canada were, there was now only a zone ruled by a kind of local martial law. According to Al, this was because the United States and Europe had joined forces to fend off the common threat from China and Russia. However, the nuclear war that resulted escalated to such an extreme that billions of lives were lost. The total population of the Earth was down to 300 million. No government, no wars, no money. According to his own statements, however, Al was not supposed to remain in the year 2137. No, he was sent another 612 years into the future from there. And when he arrived in the year 2749, he discovered that the world had adapted to the new nature of their home. The futuristic technologies made it possible to build mobile, floating cities, but there was still no trace of a government in the traditional sense. Instead, control lay in the digital hands of an AI, which AI described as a synthetic intelligence computer system that worked telepathically. However, humanity no longer needed to fear another all-out war because this was simply no longer possible. There was no military, no soldiers, no navy, and no air force, so any international conflict became meaningless. And what today are euros, dollars, and the like were called credits in the year 2749, as there was no longer any need for the money we know today. Each person had their very own credit with which they could buy anything they wanted at any time. The government has extraterrestrial technologies. After his detour to the 28th century, it was time for Al to return to the year 2137. After all, his brother was still in that era. From there, the siblings traveled to the year 1984, where they met a certain Dr. John von Neumann. Apparently, he knew about the pair's incredible experiences, which is why he urged them to return to their original time and prevent the Philadelphia experiment. The men agreed to the doctor's request and destroyed the mechanism that had unhinged the fabric of space and time. It is also thanks to this return in 1943 that we now know the history of Al Bielek. After his time in the Navy, he completed his training in electronics. But soon afterwards, Al was hired by various military clients who slowly took him into their confidence and revealed almost unbelievable things. They revealed that the U.S. military was actively working on the reconstruction of extraterrestrial technologies and forging secret plans of unimaginable proportions. This is how Al ended up being recruited for the Montauk Project. This, in turn, is said to have been a series of secret experiments carried out by the U.S. government at Camp O'Hare Air Force Base in Montauk on Long Island. The conspiracy theory states, among other things, that those responsible used a radar system to try to manipulate and even remote control the minds of millions of U.S. citizens. Al himself acted as program director and exercised considerable control over the project. As befits a man in his position, he was treated to some first-class business trips by his superiors. These included a trip to the year 100,000 BC and a trip to Mars. Al also claims to have been sent to other planets to collect samples of dark energy. Why Al Bielek was not silenced? Yeah, and then he woke up? Admittedly, the things Al Bielek spouted are not exactly the kind of stories that are easy to believe. Incidentally, he also believed that his real name was Edward Cameron and that he had been alive for over 100 years. But when he went public with his extraordinary adventures, the government didn't even bother to deny his claims. It didn't even do him the honor of calling him a crazy old crank. They just let him give his lectures because, well, maybe he really was just a crazy old crank. Al himself, however, believed that the government's ignorance had a completely different background. So he wasn't stopped, threatened, or even eliminated because his time travel experiences kept him stuck in this timeline. This would have somehow led to offsetting the effects of previous time travel experiments. Oh, and one more thing. Coincidentally, the time travel Al claims to have done in 1943 sounds a lot like the template for the 1984 movie, The Philadelphia Experiment. Admittedly, in some aspects, Al's story differs quite a bit from the plot of the sci-fi flick. However, evil tongues would say that he also had about 6 years to flesh out his story after the movie was released before he turned to the public. Did the experiment really take place? It is in the nature of things that Al's version of events has attracted some criticism, even among his own, shall we call them, colleagues. For example, one alternative-leaning website has spent countless hours trying to prove that Al had nothing to do with the Philadelphia experiment. Unlike the U.S. Navy, however, the operators of the website do not doubt that the experiment really took place. The fact that this conviction still prevails in certain circles today is due in particular to a certain Carl Allen. The self-proclaimed eyewitness stated that the project was codenamed Rainbow and was based on the creation of an extreme magnetic field. However, Allen himself was not on board the USS Eldridge. He was on a merchant Navy ship in the same convoy and marveled at the spectacle from a distance. However, the scientific community has no problems with the alleged insider's account. According to them, it is simply impossible for a strong magnetic field alone to produce optical invisibility, not to mention teleportation. As mentioned earlier, the USS Eldridge is said to have disappeared in Philadelphia and suddenly appeared 500 kilometers away in Norfolk Harbor. According to the logbooks, which were published in 1943, the ship was never in Philadelphia during this time. Despite all this, one fact makes us sit up and take notice. None of Carl Allen's comrades said anything about his claims. The report was neither confirmed nor denied, and in fact, Allen was not known to those around him as a crazy crackpot, but as a very intelligent man who occasionally seemed a little distracted. But what happened to Al Bielek? Well, he died on October 10, 2011 in the Mexican city of Guadalajara.
Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg is a climate change activist, a thorn in the side of conservative politicians, and a former mine worker. Okay, granted, the days when the Swede dug for gold until she dropped are now a long time ago, so the environmentalists should have had enough time to recover sufficiently in the past 125 years. But even if we don't believe that the photo from 1898 shows us the real Greta Thunberg, isn't it incredible how much the Swede and the girl photographed resemble each other? Against this background, some people believe that the figurehead of the Fridays for Future movement actually has a functioning time machine. But what verified facts are there about the photograph? Well, as mentioned at the beginning, the photo was taken in Canada, more precisely the Yukon Territory. The man who pressed the shutter release at that time heard again on the name Eric Hägg. Thus, at the time, the Swedish documentary photographer made an extensive collection of those people who sought happiness in the harsh north. Hägg himself also tried his hand at mining, but he never struck gold. Only Greta Thunberg. The photo from the future. What is the use of all the claims about time travel if there is no evidence for it? Also, Alexander Smith knew that the blowing up of the space-time continuum can be supported best with a tangible proof. So it happened that Alexander not only told in detail about the year 2118 some years ago, but also held the suitable photo into the camera. And although the outlines of the skyline are certainly recognizable, the strangely designed greenish buildings appear very washed out. According to Alexander, however, this is not at all due to the poor quality of the future cameras, but to the fact that time travel can distort photographs. The background story of this picture is also somewhat convoluted, because Alexander actually comes from the year 1981. There, he was catapulted into our timeline as part of a top-secret CIA experiment. But in order to prove the authenticity of his story, he made a short detour to the 22nd century to take a proof photo there. There, he also learned which paths the course of human history will take in the future. Still in the middle of this century, our Earth will be visited by aliens. At the same time, our species faces many dangers. First and foremost, there are the consequences of global warming, but also an unspecified conflict between two societies will significantly change the lives of the Earth's population. Andrew Carlson. Assuming for a moment that you are from the future and accordingly possess a great deal of knowledge, how would you use it? Well, for Andrew Carlson, the answer to that question was obvious. In 2003, he invested $800 on the stock market, and 2 weeks later was a whopping $350 million richer. Since the authorities understandably sensed a case of illegal insider trading, Andrew was questioned by the FBI. However, what came to light during the questioning should have made investigators question their common sense. Yes, Andrew knew full well that his high-risk trades were going to hit the mark. After all, he was 250 years from the future. If you think the story can't get any more wacky, listen carefully now. The FBI couldn't find any documents proving Andrew's existence before 2002. But that's not all. Shortly thereafter, the self-proclaimed time traveler disappeared from the scene and has never been seen since. World Cup 1962. In a time when terms such as substitutions and penalty shootouts were still foreign words, 16 national teams met to crown the new soccer world champion in Chile. Today, we know that title went to Brazil in 1962. The Selecao managed to defeat Czechoslovakia 3-1 in the final. However, a photo was taken during the victory celebration that leaves some viewers with raised eyebrows to this day. While the Brazilian player is holding the trophy up to the sky, we see what looks like a modern smartphone at the bottom of the picture. The man on the beach. And speaking of smartphones, the man who was on Towan Beach in the English town of Newquay in September 1943 has also been suspected of being a time traveler for quite some time. At first, however, the person seems anything but unusual. He is dressed exactly as we would expect for the 1940s. However, he is said to be holding something in his hands that bears striking similarities to a cell phone. A relaxing round of Candy Crush by the sea? Or just a man rolling a cigarette after all? Feel free to write your thoughts on this photo in the comments below. Rudolph Fentz. On a balmy summer evening in 1950, some passerby in New York's Times Square made a strange observation. Suddenly, a strangely dressed man appeared on the scene, standing completely disoriented in the middle of an intersection. But before the bystanders could say anything, the stranger was hit by a car and fatally injured. When officers examined the body shortly thereafter, they discovered some strange items. Leaving aside the atypical 19th century clothing, the deceased was still carrying a bill for washing a carriage, outdated banknotes, business cards, and a letter. The business cards showed that the man's name was Rudolph Fentz, and although the letter bore a postmark from 1876, it looked as if it had been written only a few hours ago. Further investigation revealed that there had indeed been a man named Rudolph Fentz. However, he disappeared without a trace in exactly the same year in which the letter had been sent. At the time, Rudolph was 29 years old, an age that perfectly matched the appearance of the man who had died. The Mike Tyson fight. Why travel to the Middle Ages or the ancient Egyptians when you can take a detour to the era of Mike Tyson? This is probably what the supposed time traveler thought when he attended the comeback of the scandal boxer on August 19, 1995. As we know, the heavyweight champion had spent the last 3 years behind bars. After his release, he faced Peter McNeely in the ring. And at the beginning of the first round, we see a man in the audience apparently filming the two opponents with a modern cell phone. In conclusion, we can only hope that the time traveler turned his smartphone from the future in on time. The fight lasted only 89 seconds. The Chronovisor. Always wanted to watch the crucifixion of Jesus? Watch Napoleon in his campaigns? Or marvel at the lost play Thyestes by Quintus Ennius? No problem. All you have to do is dive into the most secretive corners of the Vatican and take a look at the Chronovisor. Well, provided that the statements of the Roman Catholic priest Pellegrino Ernetti are true, of course. Incredible but true, in the early 90s, the clergyman claimed that the church is in possession of a machine that can open a literal window into the past. Allegedly developed with the help of Werner von Braun and Enrico Fermi in the 1950s, it would be a sort of long display case with a CRT screen. In detail, optical time travel would be made possible by the Chronovisor receiving, decoding, and reproducing the electromagnetic waves left by past events. And although Ernetti later confessed that the supposed photo of the crucified Savior was a fake, he maintained until his death in 1994 that the Chronovisor was real. Chaplin's Time Traveler. In October 2010, Northern Irish filmmaker George Clark sent the net community into an uproar. He posted a clip titled Chaplin's Time Traveler on YouTube in which he analyzed the bonus material of the film The Circus. The corresponding DVD contains, among other things, a few clips from the premiere of the flick. And at one point we see a woman walking through the frame holding a strange object to her ear. Clark stated that this looked like a kind of cell phone. And we are talking about the year 1928, mind you. While the video was clicked millionfold and even taken up in some TV reports, the time travel theory gathered even more supporters around itself. However, there are also approaches which would likely explain the material with the means of the 20s. Thus, the opposing side points out that we most likely here see only a woman using one of the relatively new portable hearing aids at that time. Sergei Ponomarenko. In 2006, police officers in Kiev couldn't believe their ears. The strangely dressed man with the old-fashioned camera claimed rock solid that he was born in 1932 and yet is only 25 years old. It got even more wacky when he then produced a Soviet passport from the 50s that actually matched his statements. In detail, the young man named Sergei Ponomarenko stated that in 1957 he was busy taking some photos of the city when the world around him suddenly changed. And indeed, the camera model Sergei had with him had not been produced since the 1970s. But even more amazing was the film it contained. The developed photos showed Kiev as it looked in the 1950s. Mike Markham. It's the year 1995 when Mike Markham is working on a self-created high-voltage arc in his hometown of Stanberry, Missouri. But then, the young man does something extremely puzzling. He throws a small piece of metal through the device and joyfully witnesses it momentarily disappear, only to reappear a few meters away. According to urban legend, this was the moment when Mike knew that time travel was possible. The problem was that the parts required to generate the necessary energy were damn expensive. As a result, Mike decided to break into the local power plant and make off with $20,000 worth of transformers. However, after a power outage in his neighborhood and an arrest for theft, the time-traveling enthusiast found himself behind bars. What followed were several appearances on a radio show where Mike shared the most adventurous theories and updates on his progress in building a time machine with incredulous listeners. But then, in the year 1997, something happened that no one had ever expected. Mike suddenly disappeared without a trace. Shortly before, he had mentioned that his time machine was nearly complete. He was planning to travel to the past soon, taking only his cell phone with him. Shortly after the mysterious disappearance, a listener contacted the show with a bizarre story from the 1930s. At that time, the police had discovered a dead man on a California beach. The unidentified victim had been crushed to death inside a strange metal tube, and near the body was a mysterious device that closely resembled a modern cell phone. Andrew Carlson. In the year 2003, Andrew Carlson invested $800 in the stock market, a sum that would grow to over $350 million in just 2 weeks. Faced with this incredible windfall, investigators suspected a case of illegal insider trading, leading to the arrest of the 44-year-old at that time. During questioning, Andrew provided an unbelievable explanation for his success on Wall Street. He claimed to be a time traveler from the year 2256, which is why he knew exactly which stocks to invest in. But the best part was yet to come. After the investigators astonishingly found no records about the suspect beyond the year 2002, Andrew disappeared from the scene forever. The hipster. Is it proof of time travel or simply the result of an extravagant fashion style? Few other photos have divided the online community as much as the one taken in November 1941 in Canada. On the occasion of the reopening of the South Fork Bridge, a colorful crowd had gathered. However, one man clearly stands out from the crowd. While the others are dressed as we would expect for the 40s, this visitor is wearing a printed t-shirt, modern sunglasses, and is holding a compact camera that seems completely out of place in that era. The surfer. Hang loose. Just like the case of the 1940s hipster, the following black and white photograph shows us a person who was fashionably decades ahead of their time. Taken in 1917, also in Canada, the man with his wind-tousled hair, baggy t-shirt, and knee-length shorts appears like a classic surfer dude. Even the men sitting around the surfer seem completely astonished by this appearance. The ancient laptop. Officially, the birth of laptops is dated back to the year 1983. However, a glimpse at a mysterious tombstone from ancient Greece raises the suspicion that mobile computers actually have a millennia-old history. The artifact shows us a large woman seated at a sort of throne, accompanied by a slave holding an object that indeed resembles a notebook. Even more puzzling are the two holes on the side of the depiction, which some creative observers interpret as ancient USB ports. Did the ancient Greeks truly invent the laptop, or was the device brought to the past by a time traveler? Well, according to the view of conservative experts, the answer is neither. In reality, the supposed computer is nothing more than a flat jewelry casket. The man with the cell phone. The following photo was taken in 1943 in the Icelandic capital of Reykjavik. At first glance, there seems to be nothing unusual about the image, which depicts a normal everyday scene on the street. However, if we take a closer look at the man standing slightly apart from the shop window, we notice a peculiar detail. Is he not holding his right hand in the same manner as someone who is talking on a cell phone? Once the photo surfaced on the internet, it immediately sparked the most exciting theories, from a time traveler from the future to a covert Nazi spy, to a regular man who just wanted to check if his wristwatch was still working. The explanations range from more to less spectacular. Project Pegasus. Andrew Basiago, who ran for the presidency of the United States in 2015, made headlines a few years ago with an incredible claim. Allegedly, in the 1970s, the US was actively seeking ways to achieve time travel. Moreover, the highly classified Project Pegasus was also engaged in studying the effects of teleportation. But that's not all. Supposedly, the top-secret personnel even succeeded in traveling to the future and gathering crucial information about the course of world history. But how did Basiago come to know about all these unimaginable things? Well, according to his own statements, he was one of the young guinea pigs himself, on whom the technologies were tested. He believes that massive amounts of taxpayer money were invested in the project, based on Einstein's special theory of relativity. However, ultimately, the government deemed time travel too dangerous and unpredictable, leading to the discontinuation of Project Pegasus. To put Basiago's claims into perspective, it is worth mentioning that he also claims to have been to Mars and witnessed the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. While this is a bold assertion, it could potentially be supported by a contemporary photograph from 1863. The young boy looking to the right in the photo would be none other than Andrew Basiago. Mysterious woman. Charlie Chaplin knew how to make the world laugh, but did he also unknowingly provide us with undeniable proof of the existence of time travel? Well, at least that's what some viewers believe who have closely examined a scene from the silent film, The Circus. Filmed in 1928, we see a woman briefly walking from right to left behind the zebra. And although she is only visible for a few seconds, she becomes the real star of the film for many viewers. After all, we can all see with our own eyes how she uses a modern cell phone. But what is it in the background of this video footage? Did the woman perhaps want to send us a hidden message, demonstrating that time travel is real? Or was she simply scratching her face while talking to herself? Those who are not familiar with the concept of disrupting the space-time continuum suspect that the lady was wearing one of those portable hearing aids that had recently come onto the market. 4 years before the filming, Siemens had filed a patent for a pocket-sized device of this kind. Given her fine hat and long fur coat, the woman could certainly afford to own one of these expensive gadgets. Mysterious painting. Next, we come across an artwork that becomes increasingly peculiar the longer we examine it. Created in 1937, the painting depicts a Native American once again gazing at an object that resembles a typical smartphone. The motif loosely revolves around the clash between the Pocumtuck and Nipmuc tribe members with English settlers in the village of Agawam, present-day Massachusetts. However, terms like Steve Jobs and iPhone were completely unknown at that time, leading many people to search for alternative explanations unrelated to time travel. Accordingly, it is possible that the Native American is observing a blade, a prayer book, or a small mirror. John Titor. Although John Titor was born in 1998, he wrote his first internet forum post just 2 years later. However, this was not because John was a true prodigy, but because he hailed from the year 2036. In his postings, he claimed to be an American soldier stationed in Tampa, Florida. As part of his duty, he was involved in a top-secret government time travel project that sent him straight to the year 1975. Specifically, the people in the future needed an IBM 5100 computer to debug old programs. For personal reasons, John made a brief stop in the year 2000 to collect some photos that were lost during the Civil War. But which Civil War was he referring to? Well, according to Titor's not-so-bright future prospects, a bloody conflict would erupt in the United States in 2008. As a result, the division of the USA would dramatically change. Instead of 50 states, it would be divided into 5 large regions. In 2015, the chaos of the American fighting would then spill over to other countries, escalating into a short but dramatic Third World War. Given that not a single prediction has come true so far, one might think that the person behind the name John Titor was nothing more than a brazen liar. However, even for this case, the author of the forum post provided an explanation back then. John referred to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. It is possible that the events in his timeline differ somewhat from what is happening in ours. Therefore, we are by no means spared from major catastrophes, it just takes a bit longer for them to occur in our timeline.
Sergei Ponomarenko. Back in 2006, a young man named Sergei Ponomarenko was seen traveling down the busy streets of Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine. This man was just 25 years old, though he looked considerably different than everyone else in the city who had been traveling around him. Interestingly, his clothes didn't match the current time at all. Rather, he looked as though he was wearing clothing that had been made many years ago. He looked as though he'd been dressed sometime in the Middle Ages, yet he was wandering around the metropolis streets as though he were just another passerby. The man's appearance only grew stranger when locals began to notice the odd camera he had been tightly holding near his chest. This camera looked to be a relic from a bygone era, yet it was fully functional, and the man seemed to be clinging to it with the utmost security. As people passed him by and traveled down the busy city streets, Sergei looked around, seemingly confused, disoriented, and without direction. It wasn't long before the young man caught the attention of a group of police officers. When they first noticed him, they thought he may have been playing a joke on them. The man approached the officers and asked for directions to an address, though this address had not existed for many years. The police grew suspicious and asked the man to show his identification card. To their surprise, he pulled his ID from his wallet and presented it to them. His ID had expired over 50 years ago. The ID explained that the man was named Sergei Ponomarenko, and that he had been born in 1932. If this were correct, the man would have been about 74 years old. However, the youthful man was far from elderly. Police did the best they could to help him, and they directed him to a mental facility, believing he had somehow lost his identity and was now impersonating an elderly man. He was taken in and evaluated by mental health professionals. But what happened next was very strange. Rather than reveal to doctors that this was simply an elaborate prank, Sergei insisted that he was telling the truth and that he was born in 1932, though he seemed unaware of how he had arrived in the busy city of Kiev. One of his doctors was an amateur photographer and immediately recognized the camera that Sergei had been using. The device, a Yashima Flex, was one of the oldest portable Japanese cameras ever created. These cameras were remarkably rare, and it seemed odd that Sergei would be walking around in public with such a collectible and valuable camera. As the doctors continued to question him, he insisted that he was born on June 16, 1932 in Kiev. He told doctors he was just 25 years old and had left his home early that morning to take photos in the city. Though as he exited his home, he noticed a strange object flying through the sky. He studied the object for a while and realized it was shaped like a bell. It hovered in the air for a moment, but Sergei quickly became disoriented and found himself in a place he was unfamiliar with. He recalled that the basic features of the area resembled his hometown, though it was much different than it had previously been. He explained that many of the shops and vehicles were unfamiliar to him, leading him to wander the city streets in a confused stupor. The doctors were unfazed by his claims and believed he had simply been suffering from delusions. To prove this, they took his camera and developed the film. After the photos were developed, experts confirmed that the images had been captured in 1958. To take things a step further, Sergei appeared in several of the photos wearing the same clothing he was found in when officers took him to the hospital. Many of the photos showed the streets of Kiev as they were some 50 years ago, though the mystery doesn't end there. As the doctors continued to scan the photos, they noticed something in the background of one of the images that appeared to be floating in the sky. To their surprise, it was none other than the bell-shaped object that Sergei had been telling them about. That evening, Sergei was taken to a holding room and locked inside while doctors worked to come up with a plan for his treatment. The room was sealed off, and the windows had bars on the outside so that patients could not escape or leap from the windows. To escape a room like this would be theoretically impossible. However, the following morning, Sergei was gone. He didn't leave a shred of evidence behind aside from the photos that the doctors had developed on his behalf. He was never seen again. To take this case a step further, in the year 1960, a man named Sergei Ponomarenko was reported missing by family and friends. He was never found. Alfred Bielek. In 1984, the film The Philadelphia Experiment was released in theaters. The action-packed film takes the audience into the turmoil of the Second World War. At the time, the American government was working on a top-secret project that would combine supernatural elements with real warfare tactics to distract enemy forces and leave them vulnerable to attack. To do this, the Navy developed a new type of technology that would keep their warships from being visible on radar. However, this endeavor led to the ship disappearing completely after a sudden flash of lightning. The ship was found a short time later. The passengers were severely traumatized, claiming to have had a supernatural experience. Some crew members were seriously injured after the incident, while other members of the crew were deemed clinically insane. Alfred Bielek watched The Philadelphia Experiment in the 1980s. He was seriously impressed by the film and took a deep interest in the topics that the film had covered. A short time later, fragmented portions of memories began to pop up in the elderly man's mind in a mysterious way. The memories felt more real than they ever had before. The eerie scenes in Alfred Bielek's mind continued to intensify, causing him to feel as though he was losing his mind. He sought help from a medical professional and explained that he was having flashbacks of a troublesome life, though he had never lived through these vivid and traumatizing experiences. As the memories began to piece themselves together, Alfred felt as though he had finally uncovered the truth. He believed he was Edward Cameron, a crew member from the Philadelphia Experiment, and that he had been reincarnated after the tragedy. Edward Cameron is said to have witnessed the supernatural series of events firsthand when he was a soldier. Shortly after the mysterious equipment on board the ship was activated, the crew began to panic. To escape the chaos, Edward decided to jump off the ship, though instead of ending up in the water, however, he found himself in a hospital in the year 2137. A little while later, the American woke up in the year 2749. Edward Cameron was allegedly sent by the government on countless other time-traveling adventures before his soul reincarnated into the body of Alfred Bielek. This story is wild, But Alfred claims that he's telling the truth and that all of these events truly happened. Paul Dinock. A Swiss man named Paul Dinock fell into a serious coma in 1921. He remained in the coma for about a year, but when he awoke, he had a vast knowledge of the study of physics. He had never taken schooling for physics, nor had he worked in the field a day in his life. How is it that a seemingly normal man could fall into a coma for a year, then awaken a genius in his newfound field of expertise? Paul claims that when he fell into the coma, his soul was transported into the body of a man named Andrew Northam. Andrew was a physics teacher who lived in the year 3906. He lived a full life as Andrew Northam for a year and learned many events that will soon take place in world history. He says that the world will soon be plagued by overpopulation and famine, as well as climate change. He said that these ideas led many people to break away from the molds of society to form a new spiritual lifestyle. He added that large areas of the world will be destroyed by a future world war, and that the remaining inhabitants of the earth would band together and unite. He concluded his statements by saying that humans will soon be visited by an extraterrestrial race that will help humans continue to survive and thrive, with every resident of the New World having a home and sufficient food, as well as access to endless knowledge. When Paul awoke from his coma and told his story, most of those around him felt as though he was either lying or that all of his claims were simply a dream. Regardless, Paul stuck to his word and found a small following of people who still believe his claims to this day. He passed away 2 years later in 1924. The Man from Taured. The mystery of the Man from Taured has been around since the 1950s. This man appeared in a Japanese airport and was described as a European-looking man who spoke several languages. He claimed to have been from a country known as Taured, and his identification documents confirmed this. Locals couldn't understand what the man was talking about, but he began to grow impatient and explained that Taured had existed for over 1,000 years. He pointed to his country on a map, but was shocked to learn that it was listed as Andorra. Japanese police believed the man was attempting to commit identity fraud, so they arrested him and locked him in a cell. They returned the following morning to continue their interview with him, but he had vanished as quickly as he had arrived. He was never seen again. The Time Travel Hotel. In October 1979, the time had finally come. After long months of hard work, two married couples who were friends deserved a break. Jeff and Pauline wanted to spend the holiday together with Len and Cynthia in Spain. However, the friends had to drive through France to get there, so they looked for a place to stay near the town of Montelimar. However, since the first motel was hopelessly overcrowded, the vacationers kept looking and finally ended up on a street lined with historic buildings and old-fashioned circus posters. Fortunately, the group got lucky this time. The friends found a hotel that they could check into immediately. The fact that the property didn't have elevators or phones was odd, but that was probably simply due to the hotel's old-fashioned style. The rooms also seemed strangely outdated. The doors had no locks but bolts. The bathrooms were also outdated, and the sheets were calico, a cheap fabric that hadn't been used as bed linen in decades. Despite these strange circumstances, the two couples stayed the night at the hotel. As they headed down to breakfast the next morning, 3 other people entered the accommodation who couldn't have been stranger. The woman who walked through the door was wearing an old-fashioned dress. Police officers' uniforms had been out of date for over 70 years. The friends were all the more pleased when it was time to pay for the room. The price was almost ridiculously low. After the group continued their holiday and spent 2 relaxing weeks in Spain, it was time to return. And this time too, the couple wanted to make a stopover in the strange but pleasantly inexpensive hotel. And they probably would have done that if the buildings had still been there. Although the friends found themselves on the same street with the old houses and the circus advertisements, there was no trace of the hotel. No less inexplicable was the fact that all the photos they had taken at the hotel were missing after developing. Even when Len and Cynthia returned to the region in the 1980s, the building was still swallowed up by the face of the earth. But how is that even possible? Those who believe that the story cannot be explained by our conventional means are convinced that the couples witnessed a time jump. In other words, the hotel briefly traveled into the future, only to return to its own time afterwards. But even this case is accompanied by some big questions. Why weren't the hotel employees surprised at the modern clothing of the guests? And why did they accept modern cash? Do you have a theory? Feel free to let us know in the comments below. Driving into the future. When the two friends, Charlie and Elsie, drove along the Highway 167 on October 20th, 1969, they were amazed. Next to them was a vintage car that had fallen out of time, but was in completely new condition and had a license plate from 1940. At first, it seemed as if this was the vehicle of a passionate collector who was on his way to a car show. A closer look, however, revealed the supposed vintage car enthusiast was actually a young woman and small child, also dressed in clothes from the 1940s. The initial confusion quickly gave way to great concern. It seemed that the driver, who was in tears, was at the end of her strength. Elsie immediately asked her through the roll-down window if the woman needed help, which she answered in the affirmative with a short nod of her head. The two friends pulled up, only to pull up to the side of the road. But when they turned around, there was no sign of the old car. Moments later, another vehicle screeched to a halt. The driver immediately jumped out and asked the puzzled buddies if they knew what had just happened, because the classic car in front of him had just vanished into thin air. The men spent the following hour looking for the missing car, but it was not to be found again. Do you think the mysterious woman actually traveled through time and then returned to the past? Alien invasion warning. In October of 2017, police officers in the U.S. state of Wyoming became aware of a man who pretended to be from the future. He introduced himself as Brian Johnson and said he was tasked with saving the world. He reportedly came from the year 2048 and was sent here by aliens to warn residents about an impending race of evil aliens who threatened to wipe out humanity. However, as it would turn out, he had traveled too far back into the past. He was supposed to travel to 2018, but his machine miscalculated and sent him too far back. His case is interesting because police noted that he was acting strangely and smelled like alcohol. He justified this by saying the aliens had given him alcohol so he'd be able to survive the journey into the past. But this was obviously a bit too far-fetched to believe. In the end, the officers took him in and placed him in a holding cell until he was sober. Time and space travel by a Spanish soldier. This case revolves around a Spanish soldier named Gil Perez, who appeared in the Plaza Mayor of Mexico City back in October of 1593. He showed up visibly confused and reported that he knew the governor of Manila, adding that the mayor had been assassinated on October 25, 1593. However, police told him the current date was October 24th. They then arrested him for desertion and witchcraft. About 2 months later, a ship came in from Manila, informing the locals that the governor had indeed been assassinated on October 25th. One of the men on the ship also told police that he saw the soldier, Gil Perez, in Manila on the 23rd, though this could not have been possible if he was already in Mexico City on the 24th. In the end, the soldier was released from prison. Is it possible that this man may have somehow accidentally traveled through time? Victor Goddard. It's 1935 when Brit Victor Goddard takes to the skies once again. Having started in Edinburgh, the commander of the Royal Air Force headed for his home base in Andover, England. Acting on a sudden intuition, Victor decided that day to slightly alter his planned route and pass through a derelict airfield in Drem. At this point, however, not much was left of the military splendor that the facility built during World War I once exuded. The hustle and bustle had long since given way to hangars that were half ruined and overgrown with plants. But then out of nowhere, the inexplicable happened. As Victor approached Drem, his plane suddenly got caught in a bizarre storm. The machine was shaken so hard that the pilot briefly thought he was losing control. Shortly before the plane finally gave up the ghost, the cloud cover cleared and revealed something almost unbelievable. Where previously derelict buildings had been rusting away, there was now a fully functional airfield. The four machines on the ground presented themselves in a bright yellow, but since this was not the color of the Royal Air Force at the time, Victor was taken aback. In addition, the Brit had never seen one of the aircraft models before. The ground crew didn't wear the typical clothes of Victor's comrades either. Before the pilot could make sense of the strange scene on the ground, his plane disappeared again in a storm of cloudy mud. Fortunately, the experienced commander managed to get to Andover unscathed. But what really happened back then? In retrospect, Victor flew over a Royal Air Force base. The problem is that in 1935, the airfield did not even exist. In fact, it wasn't until 1939 that the British Air Force began painting their aircraft yellow. The unknown type of aircraft and the changed clothing of the mechanics only came into circulation then. Given the circumstances, Victor was firmly convinced that he had unexpectedly become a time traveler and caught a glimpse of the future. However, the Briton fell on deaf ears in the ranks of his comrades. Many people believe that the pilot made up the story to attract attention. Mysterious music. A few years ago, Peruvian doctor Raul Rios Centeno met what was probably the most mysterious patient of his entire career. When the woman visited the practice in Lima, she was in a terrible condition. With her nerves completely at the end, she could no longer move half her body. From a medical point of view, however, this hemiplegia made no sense at all. The computed tomography showed that the patient was physically perfectly healthy. Intrigued by this mysterious case, Centeno was even more amazed when the woman began to tell her bizarre story. Shortly before her mysterious illness, the patient had been camping with friends. In detail, the campsite was located near the Marcahuasi Plateau, with its unusually shaped formations reminiscent of the faces of humans and animals. The mysterious mountain range has been revered for countless centuries. Then one evening, the friends suddenly heard music. In order to trace the source of the melody, the group headed towards the rock massifs, where their eyes finally met something inexplicable: a small stone hut that was lit from within. What's more, inside the building, some mysterious figures seemed to be dancing around wildly. Seized by curiosity, the future patient approached this unreal scene. The strange thing, the closer she got to the hut and the music, the greater the oppressive feeling in her chest. However, the woman ignored the growing fear and ventured a look through the open door. What she then saw couldn't have been stranger. The inhabitants of the hut wore clothes that had been out of fashion for centuries, but something persuaded the woman to set foot in the building, only to be grabbed by the shoulder and pulled back by a friend at the last moment. At that very moment, the patient felt a painful twinge in her body, which was followed by severe numbness. Since then, the woman has been unable to move the affected side of her body. Some paranormal experts believe that the woman was about to travel to another dimension. What would have happened if she had actually entered the cabin is uncertain. Other researchers believe the building literally fell out of time. Apart from this time jump theory, the background of this bizarre story is also attributed to extraterrestrial activities. CIA time travel program Project Pegasus. Andrew Basiago claims to be a time traveler as well. He says that he can see both the past and the future, with all of this being made possible due to a CIA time travel program known as Project Pegasus. The project was carried out between 1962 and 1972 and was designed to contact previous presidents, teleport people to Mars, and even maintain relationships with aliens, allegedly, of course. Aside from the idea of being able to physically travel back in time, Project Pegasus would also help to create two new technologies: the ability to teleport and travel back in time through means of a holograph. Andrew told crazy stories about his time working with the CIA and says that he now has a goal of becoming president so that he can declassify all the information about the project and bring the technology to the masses. If this were to ever happen, history would be permanently changed forever. But what's particularly scary is that if Andrew's telling the truth, we would never know. Even if the government was able to change the past and impact the future, we would have still grown up blissfully unaware of the changes. Andrew Carson. In 2003, Andrew Carson was arrested by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. He had apparently made about 126 high-risk stock trades and managed to make heaps of money on each of these trades. He invested an initial amount of just $800, but managed to instantly turn that money into $350 million. As a result, he made a 4-hour confession to the SEC and claimed that he was a time traveler from the distant future and that he was able to accurately trade these stocks as a result of looking at future market trends. He says that in exchange for serving a small amount of time in prison, he would release details about the location of Osama bin Laden, a man who had been on the run from the United States for many years. He also claimed to have detailed information about a cure for AIDS. What makes the case of Andrew super strange is that he managed to be temporarily released from prison on bail. However, as soon as he was released, he disappeared and was never seen again. Is this 1930s painting evidence of time travel? This work is a famous painting from 1937, which was named Mr. Pynchon and the Selling of Springfield. At first glance, it doesn't reveal anything too unusual. It shows a scene from colonial times as an Indian sits in a boat and looks like he's having a good time. It looks like he's probably about to transport a large load of cargo in his boat. But what is he looking at? It can hardly be denied that the object in his hands looks like a smartphone. The dark spot on the back even looks like the lens of the camera. Though this would be impossible, right? What is the man holding in his hand? A stone tablet or a kind of sculpture? Maybe even a compass? It's too difficult to say for sure, but theories have been running wild since this painting debuted online several years ago, especially since he's the only person with an object like this. All the other Indians in the area are staring around, waiting to depart. Is this truly a time traveler with a smartphone? Let us know what you think in the comments. Is Greta Thunberg a time traveler? Whether you love her or hate her, I'm sure all of us know who Greta Thunberg is by this point. The teenager has been making the headlines for over a year now. Even though she's still very young, Greta has dedicated her life to proving the impact of climate change and what it may mean for humanity if major changes aren't made in our day-to-day lives. She's very adamant about her position and isn't afraid to stand up against major politicians to let her voice be heard. Some people jokingly claim that she's a time traveler who has come from the future to save our planet. This may sound completely ridiculous, but it's not as crazy as some of the other theories we've heard over the years about lizard people running the government. However, this strange theory about Greta is actually backed up by some photographic evidence. Take a look at this photo and let us know what you think in the comments. We know that people can look alike, but this 120-year-old photo shows a girl looking for gold who looks a lot like Greta Thunberg. Does Greta's mission to save the planet go this far back in time? If that is the case and this photo is proof, she's obviously not only active in today's world, but may travel far back in time to let her voice be heard as well. But if this is true, why are the ice caps still melting? Is John Travolta from the past? This photo has recently shown up on eBay where someone was putting it up for sale. It's supposed to be the ultimate proof that John Travolta is also a time traveler. At first, you might think it's not that special that someone looks like John Travolta but was born many years ago. But there's something truly strange about this photo. The person in the photo doesn't just look like John Travolta, it seems like he's the exact same person. The two have the same exact eyes, the same hairline, and even the same chin structure. In addition, John Travolta is a fairly mysterious man anyway, which has only reinforced this theory now that John has become so deeply involved in the world of Scientology. After all, the so-called religion believes in reincarnation, and if that's true, then time travel is no longer an illogical concept. How long has John Travolta been around, and why doesn't he seem to be aging so nicely? While cosmetic surgery has come a long way in recent years, is this really the secret to John's youth, or is there something else at play here? Does this photo prove that time travel is possible? As we've become the Photoshop generation, we know that pictures may not tell the full story when it comes to history or mysterious events that have been posted online. It's so easy to edit a photo and make it appear to show something that never happened. But there are pictures that are so old and can be found in official textbooks that we can say nothing has been edited here, and these photos are completely legitimate. That is also the case with this image. As you can see, a man is sitting down, relaxed on a stone ledge, and just looking towards the camera. But something is very strange about this man. Is it just me, or does the man seem totally out of place? He's wearing a sports shirt, baggy pants, and no hat. Instead, he lets the wind blow through his oddly modern hairstyle, which also doesn't match the time period in which the photo was taken. To his right, a woman points her finger at him, and on the left, a man looks over at him very excitedly. It seems as if the man came from another time, and those around him are just now noticing. This also makes sense because if he were just an everyday man, why would someone have taken a photo of him in the first place? Did the U.S. discover time travel during the Cold War? A U.S. lawyer by the name of Andrew Basiago has been trying to uncover the truth about the Pegasus project for some time. This was a top-secret U.S. mission during the Cold War. The whole purpose of the project was to find a way to manipulate the space-time continuum so that the United States could win the war against Russia. To make things even stranger, Basiago himself claimed that he was sent back in time to attend Abraham Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address in 1863. His father also knew about this and worked on the project until it was discontinued in 1968, as it was deemed far too dangerous. Apparently, scientists used Einstein's theory of relativity and the possibility of wormholes to allow people to travel through time. It may sound completely insane, but why would a seasoned, educated lawyer with stories like this voluntarily damage his reputation in such a serious way? Does this punk come from another time? A few short glances are enough for you to see that this photo is definitely from another period of time. The way people are dressed, the horses, the carriages, the boats and houses, everything indicates that this image was captured long ago. In the midst of the hustle and bustle of daily life, another person joins in on this photo, but he doesn't really fit in with everyone else. A man can be seen in the middle of this photo who is referred to as the punk by people who first noticed him. Again, it's difficult to understand why this person, many decades before the punk movement, was walking around with such a haircut and wearing a sleeveless shirt and suspenders. It's unlikely to be someone who was simply 70 years ahead of the punk trend. This image really helps explain the theories surrounding time travelers, as it seems incredibly strange that a man would expose himself to such ridicule at the time, simply to sport such an odd and off-the-wall haircut and clothing style. But again, stranger things have happened. What is this man holding in his hand on the beach? Similar to the previous photo, which shows an Indian who appears to be holding a smartphone, the man in this photo is also looking at a strange object in his hand that looks shockingly like a modern piece of tech. One thing is clear, here too the picture shows that it came from another time period. It was shot in September of 1943, and again, the person stands out not only because of their behavior, but also because of their strange clothes that don't really fit into the style of the time period. In addition to this, the man in the photo looks suspiciously downwards, and in his entire posture, from body to hands, is reminiscent of a smartphone user that you may see on every street corner today. If it's not a cell phone, what else could he be holding in his hands? There were no Game Boys at the time, nor were there any other portable gadgets or computers. Who knows what this man may be up to? But it certainly doesn't seem logical that he'd just be looking at a rock or any other handheld object from that time period. Did Charlie Chaplin witness a time traveler? In 2010, a clip was uploaded to YouTube showing a largely unknown scene from the film The Circus. This was a classic movie starring Charlie Chaplin. But here too a person appears who, in a strange way, seems as if she doesn't belong there. The woman you see in the background is holding a strange device to her ear. It looks just like a smartphone, or at the very least a cell phone. Cell phones were obviously not around when this movie was filmed. Released back in 1928, it was a very different time for most people, and the idea of a mobile telephone would not pop up for another 50 years. Some experts say that this is some kind of hearing aid device and would have been very popular at the time. But what would this woman be trying to hear? The sounds of a busy street and traffic? Who knows, but this definitely looks like a cell phone to me. Has this hipster traveled back in time? We still have one last example for you of a completely strange-looking person in an old photo. This photo made its way around the internet recently because it was confirmed to be a legitimate, unedited photograph. This 1941 photo shows what is probably the first hipster in world history. He's in a small crowd of people on the day the South Fork Bridge opened in British Columbia. As you can see, he stands out because he's wearing sunglasses that are far too modern. He's also wearing a shirt that seems to have a printed logo on it, something that would not become popular for another 40 to 50 years. There have been many attempts to explain this photo over the years. One of the more popular theories claims that sunglasses like this would have existed at the time, but they would have been incredibly expensive. The same theory goes for his t-shirt and camera. Cameras like this would have also existed, but would have cost hundreds of dollars. His t-shirt could very well be a luxury item as well, with the logo on the front being hand-stitched rather than printed. Is Nicolas Cage a vampire? This is yet another photo that was sold on eBay a while back. For a massive $1 million, you could buy a picture of a person who lived in 1870 and looks exactly like Nicolas Cage. It's not known whether he simply shared the same gene pool or if this person could be a distant relative of Nicolas. However, the most likely solution seems to be obvious. Like John Travolta, Nicolas Cage may have the gift of traveling through time. Other sources are firmly convinced that Nicolas Cage is a vampire or even a zombie, but this seems a bit far-fetched. However, this would explain his odd behavior over the years, characterized by eccentric outbursts and over-dramatic facial expressions. So, is it possible that Nicolas Cage may be a time-traveling vampire? Well, virtually anything is possible. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like button and ring the notification bell for more videos.